You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. And we're back with another episode of Habitat University. We're continuing on our theme of Aldos Tools, and this week we have the Plow. That's the one we're talking about. And I let Adam do all the hard work this week. So Adam, this week the topic was the Plow. Who'd you talk to and what'd you guys talk about?
Yeah, this was a fun one for me. Of course, I always joke that I've lived on every corner of the Corn Belt, and now I just live right in the middle of it. So this is the one that I get the most excited about, and I found someone that I think actually is even more excited about it than me. That was Ryan Heiniger, who has a couple of different titles with Pheasants Forever, but he's the director of their ag land conservation programs, and he also happens to farm in southeastern Iowa, which brought some pretty interesting and different perspectives than we get from someone like me who's just kind of adjacent to agriculture. Ryan literally lives and breathes it, and he also lives and breathes wildlife conservation, wildlife habitat management. So it was a really interesting conversation.
Yes, so it sounds like a great guest to have, especially for that Plow, given that he has kind of two different roles with the Plow, right? So he's actually out there using it, but he's also thinking strategically about how can that tool be used on a larger scale to benefit a lot of wildlife species.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. And he definitely talked about a lot more than the Plow. Towards the end of the episode, he comes around, he starts to talk about like autonomous tractors and drones and like all this sophisticated technology, stuff that I think when Aldo Leopold, who is from the same home county as Ryan, actually, as we discussed in the episode, something Aldo Leopold probably couldn't have imagined, but it's really neat to see how we could potentially be harnessing this technology for good for wildlife and wildlife habitat in working agricultural landscapes. It was really interesting and had me thinking for sure.
So you covered some tools that Aldo probably couldn't even dream of when he was writing that book in the 1930s. So I look forward to listening to the episode. I know the viewers will probably like it as well. And before you give too much away, Adam, we'll cut to it and let the listeners hear your and Ryan's conversation. But before we go there, we want to let the listeners know that we now have a feedback survey that you can find at the bottom of the show notes. There'll be a link to the survey at the bottom of our show notes. This survey will help kind of set the course for this podcast and all the episodes. It will also help give us feedback about information you guys want to know and how you're using the information that we're providing. So it'd be really helpful for us if you could fill out that survey. And of course, also if you like and subscribe and comment on different podcast services, that also helps us as well. So with that, we'll get to Adam and Ryan.
Well, Ryan, welcome to Habitat University.
Thank you, Adam. Great to be joining you today.
Appreciate you coming on and sharing with us your expertise on this issue of the Plow and wildlife habitat management and agriculture generally. What I thought we could start with here is just sort of an introduction to who you are and what you do and how it is that you got to be in the current job that you're in right now.
How much time do we have? But
Plenty.
Well, this is something that's certainly near and dear to me for a number of reasons. But I wore a couple different hats for Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. Today, I guess I'll be probably wearing the Director of Agriculture hat that has almost been kind of a dream job, to be honest, growing up as a fourth generation farm kid. But I also have the privilege of serving as the Director of Field Operations for our North region, which consists of both Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. We've got a great team of about 80 biologists and program managers delivering our mission with our chapters and our partners in those states. But like I said, fourth generation farm kid, born and raised in Burlington, Iowa. Coincidentally, same hometown as Mr. Leopold himself. In fact, we were born about a mile apart.
Wow.
But about 32,000 days apart as well. So I grew up on our family farm here right along the Mississippi River. Probably witnessed a lot of the same kind of grand migrations as Leopold. Growing up here, was educated as a cyclone, and then started my career really with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in North Dakota, Devil's Lake specifically, and had the chance to work a couple years for the service. Spent about 15 years with Ducks Unlimited in a number of capacities. So, one of my feet is still webbed. I won't tell you which one, but I've always been, a waterfowl and an upland bird guy from a hunting standpoint and a conservation standpoint. And then had the great privilege of joining Pheasants Forever in 2013, which also afforded me the chance to move my family back home to my farm roots and raise, my wife and I are raising our two kids, Autumn and Matthew, on our farm as the fifth generation.
So you mentioned that in your current capacity, you supervise 80 staff. Is that the right number? You said 80?
Yeah, on the field operations side, that work daily with farmers, ranchers, and landowners. A lot of those positions are farm bill wildlife biologists, working daily out of USDA offices as part of our great partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but also a variety of other positions that work, full-time on wetland reserve easement projects, public land acquisitions, working with partners at both the state, federal, and local, county levels, as well as a variety of other kind of specialty positions, one of which is our precision ag and conservation program.
So we have a sort of nationwide listenership. So here in the Midwest, I think the value of Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever and leading private lands, wildlife conservation efforts is pretty apparent to those of us in the profession. But I'm curious if you could kind of tell us, maybe for the listeners outside the Corn Belt, why a organization named for a bird native to China. Why do you guys work in this space, and how is it that Pheasants Forever has kind of come to be a leader in this private lands, especially agricultural land conservation programs?
Phenomenal question, Adam. And so, we wear our logo proudly in terms of pheasants, as well as kind of our sister organization, Quail Forever, which together 140,000 members across the country, 700 plus grassroots chapters that mostly operate on a county by county basis. But fundamentally, we are a habitat organization. And so, it's honestly impossible to do just, projects or practices just to benefit pheasants or just to benefit quail. In fact, in reality, they're kind of the minority beneficiary when you think about the whole guild of species, not just birds, but mammals, insects, not even talking about the other environmental benefits of our work. And so it really was going on almost 20 years ago when the organization was going through some growth and some evolution and trying different things. And one of which was, certainly the acknowledgement that to be successful at our core mission for wild ringneck pheasant populations and wild bobwhite quail populations, it's imperative that we work successfully with private landowners. And so the how to do a better job in that regard really led us down the path of, partnering with the nation's largest private land agency, of course, again, NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it started with just some pilot positions in South Dakota. The history books are a little fuzzy, depending on who you listen to within the organization. where it got its start. But I think mostly, South Dakota, Wisconsin, even Minnesota argues over that title, that prestige. But, today we have 200 plus positions that have a host of other, partners that contribute. Again, state wildlife agencies, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, local soil and water districts, and of course our grassroots chapters, which, each and every one of those has the opportunity to invest in additional local capacity to work more with landowners, doing outreach, helping them navigate the different programs, the different cost share that is available. And ultimately, the goal is help the landowner achieve their stewardship goals. We're a facilitator, we're a coordinator, but ultimately, we're a guest on their land, helping advise them and make them aware of the different incentives, the different practices that are available.
That's really cool. It's a really impressive and ambitious program that you're a part of and that you lead. And so really appreciate your efforts in that. It's, I think, a perfect segue into what we wanted to talk about today, because you're talking about private landowners, and of course, private landowners and the people that steward those lands, the farmers across the country, are often engaged in managing those lands for profit. And one of the primary ways that we see that, of course, in the upper Midwest and throughout the country is for row crop agriculture. And so and you also mentioned your staff of 200 people. So I was thinking, how could we transition this? This is a perfect segue. We're talking about private landowners and agriculture and the complex decisions that they have to make. And we're talking about all these professional wildlife biologists that now have boots on the ground to help them make decisions that both positively impact production and also positively impact the wildlife that we share the landscape with. So in 1933, when your hometown hero, Aldo Leopold, wrote in Game Management, the quote that we're focusing on in the podcast, the central thesis of game management is this: game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it: the axe, the plow, the cow, the fire, and the gun. What I wanted to ask you next, Ryan, is to share with us, what do you think Leopold was thinking about in 1933 when he wrote that heretofore the plow had destroyed game, or heretofore the plow had destroyed game range?
I would say certainly a couple things, and it both, with idealism, as he's noted for, as well as pragmatism. But the reality of at the time, even on the front end of the Dust Bowl, seeing the decline of grasslands, seeing the expansion of cropland, which, intensification is a word that's used in a lot of those early writings, which, back then, with the benefit of, where we sit today, thinking about things, totally different perspective, but he witnessed, the decline, watching native habitats disappear, but also at the same time, with optimism and kind of that, as that biological science of game and wildlife management was emerging, as he himself was helping lead that, knowing full well that those were tools to put some of this habitat back for the management on private land, which throughout the different writings emphasized that the farmer himself was going to play a key role, that the public was not in a position to do so, with kind of the exception of further incentivizing, further supporting those measures, but the farmer himself would play that key role.
Yeah, I really like that thinking. And that's certainly what Leopold was working on. I recall reading his biography about his work with the Riley Game Cooperative, the network of farmers in southeastern or southwestern Wisconsin that he was working with through the University of Wisconsin, Madison, to recognize their role in stewarding wildlife resources. So yeah, there's this interesting roots there with professional wildlife management, that working with farmers, private landowners, to manage wildlife habitat goes as far back as what we today recognize as the profession that you and I are both in. So that's pretty cool. So I wanted to ask, what specifically, I guess, has changed about agriculture that has had impacts on wildlife habitat, say wildlife habitat that you're most familiar with, or just generally across the country?
So I think in large regard, through the years, through the decades, the observation has been consolidation, larger, farm sizes, but then the general trend towards fewer and fewer, crops, fewer and fewer crop diversity on the landscape. That it's trending towards just less in the rotation in terms of small grains, fewer cattle and other livestock on the land. And so, it was something that he was seeing firsthand, somewhat, predicting what would happen if that trend continued kind of unchecked. And today we see that, but at the same time, and this is where, first and foremost, I was born a farm kid and spent, my youth working on the farm, being involved on the farm before I was a trained wildlife biologist. And so even some of that intensification that Leopold saw and was very, very concerned about, in many ways led to some really booms in various wildlife populations that we still have and enjoy today. So it wasn't all negative, I guess, is the point. That with the perspective of sitting here in 2021 and looking back, we still have abundant wildlife, and in some cases even more abundant wildlife today than what he had and saw and documented in his different studies through the years. So there's reason to be optimistic, despite different things that would suggest otherwise. And that's kind of the view that I have each and every day of further engaging with landowners and farmers and other folks in that sector to continue to do good stewardship.
So I'm curious, what species of wildlife, like what do you think of when you think of farmland wildlife, like the species of wildlife that do really actually do quite well on many of our farms, and maybe particularly our diversified farms today?
Well, and even going back, to the organizational roots for Pheasants Forever and later Quail Forever, fundamentally, especially pheasants, are farm birds, right? So if you have landscapes dominated by 100% grassland, you do not find pheasants. But on the flip side of that kind of spectrum, if it is 100% crops or other land uses, even forests, you do not have pheasants. So there's kind of that balance or that harmony, of course, that he often wrote about. And so even again, back to that kind of intensification that he was seeing and further projecting, what it really led to, for just Iowa, our home state that we both reside in here today, the peak for pheasants was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so, decades after some of that initial alarm. But again, going back to waterfowl, think about Canada geese today that were even once thought to be extinct. Think about snow geese and the fact that their population exploded so much in the 90s and early 2000s, where they were actually damaging their northern breeding grounds in the Arctic of Canada. And a lot of that rationale was they were returning to their breeding grounds in such prime body condition because they had the access to waste grains that historically they never did. And so when you think about it in a biological context, and please, check me here, but there's always going to be a limiting factor somewhere in the life cycle, right? And so with the plow, with lands turning into cropland, with waste grain, whether you're talking about rice in the South, whether you're talking about corn across a lot of the country, wheat, sorghum, these are high nutrition food resources for wildlife that historically, evolutionarily, did not exist. And so in this case of snow geese, they were able to put on body reserves to make that, thousands of mile migration from the coast of Louisiana all the way to the Arctic, and have ultimately, more eggs and more chick survival, more gosling survival.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up, is like the good, essentially, that many agricultural practices can have on food resource availability. I'm curious, I'd like to go back to that point you made about pheasants peaking in Iowa in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In the podcast, we're talking a lot about like what are the specific elements of habitat. We're trying to be really judicious in our understanding of those elements. And like you said, there's always one limiting factor. And so when we think about pheasant habitat, we think about food, water, and shelter. And for an upland bird like this, we don't think too much about water and space. And so of food, shelter, and space, what do you think was different about the 50s, 60s, and 70s where we saw those peaks in pheasant numbers versus what we saw prior to that, and then probably particularly most interestingly, what we've seen since then in our agricultural landscapes?
There's no doubt that from an Iowa-specific landscape that the decline in small grains and most notably oats has been a contributing factor, not the contributing factor, but certainly the timing of oats and can provide a surrogate nesting habitat as another kind of grass species, right? And so that's one. Certainly from a cattle, livestock, forage on the landscape. I don't know if there is solid evidence or data in this regard, but certainly anecdotally we know that there's less hay ground in the state than there once was, right? And so that hay ground also provided nesting opportunities for these birds in April and May.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, yeah, so just fewer different types of crops out there. So for me, what really resonates is like a picture of a landscape in the 50s versus a picture of a landscape today. What used to be a hayfield and associated margin between the hay in the cornfield has today been converted just to a larger cornfield or a larger soybean field. And so that, I think, then we can pull from that answer like both space, which is like there's sort of arrangement of different habitat features and the amount of edge and other features that we found in our landscape has changed, and then the food sources and shelter for nesting sources and things like that. So yeah, there's a bunch of different types of components that have changed. So very interesting things to look at. And I think I'll definitely put in the show notes for the episode a link to a website in Iowa where you can look at historical aerial photographs to kind of compare what the landscape used to look like and what it looks like today, at least going back to the 1930s. So we've spent a lot of time talking about sort of the history of how we got here. What I really want to hear is your thinking, because was a director of agriculture programs. Is that your title? Yeah. So the director of agriculture programs for PF, you guys have all these boots on the ground working with farmers. So I'm curious, what is the prospects? How have we done since the 1930s with Leopold's vision for creatively applying the plow as a metaphor for agriculture to help wildlife and wildlife habitat? And where do you think we're going?
I can't quote it verbatim and probably would not even do it justice, with paraphrasing. But again, back to the vision, the philosophy of the balance between agriculture and society and landowners, that it's the pursuit of the balance that's the goal worth pursuing, not that it's maybe even achievable, that harmonious state is even achievable, but it's the worth pursuing. And of course, that's what we wake up every day striving to do. And so there is no doubt we have work to do, right? We have, whether you're talking about different population levels for various wildlife, or again, take the monarch butterfly as another example, as a non-game species. But benchmarking things, for me, 1995, a year after I graduated high school, Iowa hunters, of course, residents and non-residents. We were a destination state back then, much more than we are today. But the total harvest that year was 1.5 million roosters. And so that's a pretty lofty goal today, but I think it's still very much achievable. And so to accomplish that, of course, we do need more grass on the landscape. We do need some more of that edge the landscape that you spoke about with restoring wetlands, even as an example. The thing that I am very optimistic about, and I hope comes through loud and clear, is in my 22 plus years now in the field, I don't think there's ever been a time where really the stars have aligned. And I know that's cliche, but that the conservation interests, the environmental interests, the sportsmen and women interests, and the agricultural sector, from the farmer, him and herself, through the whole network of folks that play a role in that larger sector, all the way to the consumer, are aligned for greater sustainability on the landscape. I have not witnessed that, again, in my 22 years. And I certainly don't want to take it for granted that it's just kind of that new plateau, and it'll always be that way. So I think, we have still urgency to be able to make progress under this kind of new degree of collaboration and cooperation. And so that's even more exciting in terms of what what we're doing the last couple of years, what we're focusing on in 2021 and looking at another 5 years. That this incremental progress is going to restore some of that balance, and we're going to see the response accordingly, again, with various wildlife, as well as other parameters such as soil health indices, or even getting into the water quality and water quantity space as well.
You mentioned more sustainability on the landscape, like that was sort of, sustainability was the thing that all these different interest groups are lining up behind. And of course, wildlife stewardship would be a part of that. What does that look like in terms of how agriculture manifests itself in, say, the Corn Belt? And I guess to add to that question, how will wildlife benefit from that increased focus on that sustainability mission?
I'm going to go right back to the fact that it's embraced and led by farmers, right? All of our work is under kind of voluntary programs, incentive-based programs, but ultimately it relies on that landowner or that landowner and tenant to ultimately say, yes, I want to, or we want to do something different. And I think conservation has become normalized in a way, and almost, what's the right descriptor here? Without a doubt, the generational change in different philosophies is starting to, I think, contribute to this. But I'll even give props to my mom and my dad in terms of their recognition and watching that change over the years. Every couple of years, as a family, we band together and do prescribed burning on our habitat on our farm, and that's pretty cool. That's not something we did growing up. That's a change, right? And so we still have, again, adoption. The rate of adoption has to continue to increase, but I think with all these sectors aligned and the similarity in the messages and the advocating for the practices, whether you're talking about cover crops or more diverse rotations or grass-fed, cattle, or whatever the case is, things have aligned today that they haven't in the past. And so that's exciting. And again, reasons to be optimistic, boldly optimistic for where we're going to be in another, just few years.
I like your unapologetic optimism. I think it's really important in this space. And I think sometimes wildlife biologists, especially when they focus on rare declining species, could potentially become despondent in some of this work that we do. And I think your healthy dose of optimism about the potential mutual benefits of wildlife conservation and land stewardship, broadly defined in agriculture, is kind of a breath of fresh air. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I do appreciate that feedback. And I guess, just the other thing to add on there too is whether a motivation by a landowner is because they want to see more pheasants or more quail or more wildlife in general, or they have just, again, embraced this notion that they absolutely have to leave the land better than when they found it. And increasingly, the reality is that more and more of the science, more of the data, more of the technology is further underscoring that these practices are actually boosting the bottom lines, that it's not, restore wildlife habitat on your farm for just the pure aesthetics and nothing more, but do this because profitability and sustainability are now linked, because we have some of the tools that, in the past, we might not have even been able to dream about. Certainly nothing that was anywhere close to on the horizon back in the 30s and 40s of Leopold's time.
So give me your sales pitch, Ryan. You mentioned that you have these precision conservation specialists, these private lands conservation people. Imagine I'm a farmer and I haven't yet identified as engaging in wildlife habitat management on my farm. What's your pitch to me for finding where it may fit on my farm to do wildlife habitat management and what I'm going to get out of it? I think I've heard elements of that throughout the discussion, but I just like to sort of hear it distilled down in that scenario.
So increasingly, and again, going back to the reality, which is farms have gotten larger, undeniable truth, right? And as such, the technology has also advanced exponentially. And so today, farmers are able to track every pass across the field. They're able to track and deploy the inputs much more precisely, even down to the, from a practical standpoint, every square foot, but in reality, acre by acre approach. And as a result of that data that is being collected and warehoused in the cloud, and able to be not only stored but retrieved for further analytics, we can now combine the productivity of the land in terms of whether you're talking about bushels or bushels of any grain or bales of cotton in the case of working down south, and then look at what the input costs are and provide an analysis of what zones are profitable, what zones might be a break even, and what zones are losing money. And of course, Mother Nature has not created any degree of uniformity throughout a field, and certainly year to year, there's also a lot of variability, right, in weather and climatic conditions. And so what happens over time as these data sets stack year over year over year is these zones can get even more delineated to the point where all of a sudden you've got the hard evidence that 4 out of 5 years I have lost a crop, and therefore with the crop input budgets, I have lost X amount of money in this zone doing kind of the status quo. And so it's time to do something different. And the power of that is they'll make that decision on their own because it's an economic one. And as a result, when changes can transpire, land use changes transpire. And it's not a farm it or not farm it proposition. I want to make that also kind of abundantly clear, at least from where we sit. It's a let's look at the land use, let's look at what your goals are, and then how can we change things up to both increase your profitability and increase your environmental stewardship, but just focusing on these zones that right now are literally taking money out of your till for a farmer, out of your bottom line as a farmer. And even, the irony, Adam, is Leopold maybe foreshadowed this a little bit, and I jotted down a few things, but one reference to adjust men and machines to land, and that each acre should produce what it is good for, as no 2 acres are alike. And that's kind of our thesis.
I think that while you were describing that, I just thought, wow, I don't think Aldo Leopold could have imagined the application of the technology in the way that you're describing. And that's what's really neat about this, and sort of the evolving vanguard of the profession is thinking about applying this technology, these technological advances to help farmers and to help the land and help wildlife.
I would absolutely agree with that in terms of the ability to predict the tools and the technology would have been unimaginable. But, at his core, he was a biologist, an ecologist, a scientist. And again, back to the end use of this technology is data. And he absolutely would have embraced and encouraged us to use data for sound land use decision making. So that's kind of, at its simplest form, that's ultimately what this is. It's putting data to work to drive decisions.
That's really cool. What do you think people that are interested in wildlife and wildlife habitat, but outside of agriculture, really need to understand, maybe don't understand, and really need to understand to be able to fit into these important conversations about how we manage agricultural lands for wildlife?
Was it the Riley co-op that you had referenced?
Mm-hmm.
I had come across this also somewhere in my recent readings from Leopold, and I think it was just outside of Madison, if I remember the story right. He was out scouting, pre-hunting season scouting, and just happened to pop into a farmer's yard and strike up a conversation, which then led to that farmer convening some of his neighbors and Leopold gathering his fellow hunting buddies to talk about forming that co-op. Biologists without that ag background should just be like Leopold, to pop into a farm and strike up a conversation, with the goal being to learn and to listen. And that's one of these days I'm actually going to try to launch some kind of formalized program, but it's with the size of equipment today. The fact is that, these buddy seats, maybe you've seen some of my tweets on this, Adam, but these buddy seats are ready made for, individuals to do ride-alongs and just sit there and kind of take it all in. And I don't care if you're a 3-year-old boy or a girl, or a 70-year-old man or woman. It's fascinating, right? I mean, the way that this equipment is configured today, but you can get a front row seat, and all you have to do is ask. Farmers love to be able to do that. And their timing is everything, but I think in general, back to this, the stars aligning, and consumers being interested in knowing where their food comes from. What better place to learn than literally right there in the tractor seat itself? And when it's done with an open mind, when it's done with I want to learn, I have questions, and I'm looking for a relationship, in terms of, back to that sportsman connection directly, this would be applicable, not just for hunters, but I think that's even where it's like more valuable, to rekindle that farmer sportsman relationship that he clearly did with that co-op. But for up and coming biologists, again, that come from maybe that urban suburban setting, get out in the country, work with extension, work with NRCS folks, just drive into a yard and introduce yourself. You don't have to overthink it, I guess is the point.
I really like that. I think that's really nice advice. And I think the better we understand the complex landscape in which decisions are made about agriculture, the better we're going to be able to think about solutions that could help wildlife and agriculture coexist. And I think that's what you and Pheasants Forever do such a good job with. So I'm going to shift us here. We're going to go from like the big picture stuff that we've been talking about, which is really cool, and the stuff that Pheasants Forever is really leading on. And let's just go to the really tangible use of the plow in wildlife habitat management. And so, for one, I don't think I could possibly not do an interview like this and not bring up food plots, because that's certainly a way that an everyday landowner may be engaged in using a plow for wildlife habitat management. And so I wanted to ask you about what you're thinking on food plots. What's their role in wildlife habitat management, and what's your thinking on food plots?
So as a private landowner, myself, as an avid sportsman myself, I support food plots. We do so on our farm. There's a time and a place, and really the way I'd look at it also is what factors are within our control for ultimately having as robust populations of our game and non-game species as possible. And so if we can remove the possibility where, due to severe weather, severe winter weather up north, where it might cause additional mortality that could be a little bit avoidable, let's take that off the table by having that greater food resource next to that other winter cover possible, so that they don't have additional exposure during those key periods, which might only be days or a few weeks of the year out of one every 3 or 4 years, right? But take that off the table, so that that decline in most wildlife species, as you know better than I do, are some degree of boom bust. And so let's do what we can, make sure that when it does cycle downward, that the trough is not as deep as it might otherwise be.
Yeah, that reminds me of a paper. This is kind of in the weeds, but that's what I'm here for, because I'm the academic egghead. There's this paper about black swan events in ecology, and how, like one really bad winter can set the trajectory of a population on a downward trend for decades, or one extremely severe weather event, or fluke masting event with food production, say in the forest or something, can have these like long-term disproportionate impacts. So I like your thinking on that. I also heard in your answer something that I like, is like, well, you can't have food without cover. So you mentioned you put your food plots next to cover. And that's something I think that the listeners will hopefully catch on, a pretty consistent theme, that we can't have one element of habitat without another. So what are some other examples of the creative use of the plow in wildlife habitat management that come to mind?
Before I go there, the other thing I would say is, who doesn't enjoy time tinkering on a tractor, right?
Yeah.
Or with a drill. And so for those landowners out there, it's just one more convenient excuse to spend time in the off season, knowing your land, looking for signs, looking for wildlife, doing observation, citizen science, and just maximizing the value again of your property, whether it's 5 acres or 500, but just kind of continuing that line, and not to blur into the other components of the heretofore. But the plow would actually go very well with the fire, right? And so what do I mean by that? In not every case is it possible to have a nice, clean fire break. And so the plow can play a heck of a role for greater security, greater confidence that when you do light that match, that prescribed fire match, you're going to be able to contain it to that zone that you're wanting to have ecological setback. And so those two work in tandem together in many ways. And, a lot of agencies, a lot of public lands that I hunt, the plow is honestly used to set that up and have a safe and productive and efficient prescribed fire. You didn't see that one coming, did you?
Well, I like it. So I actually wondered if you would connect the cow to the plow as well, because a lot of times, you've mentioned how hay fields were really important historically, and we have fewer hay fields today, and that hay, of course, is feeding the cows, and so it's like a picture in coupled systems of livestock and row crops. So I thought maybe you were talking how the fire and the plow connect. I thought, I wonder if he's going to connect the cow and the plow, because they certainly do connect as well in our agricultural landscapes.
Well, it is hard, to be honest, as I was thinking about this opportunity and trying to compartmentalize almost just a one aspect of land management. It is hard, but this is fun to think through. And so, hearkening back to almost a lifetime ago in my career, when I had the chance to be more of a field practitioner, the plow, literally the moldboard plow, came in quite handy as almost a preferred strategy or a tool to set back invasive species like reed canary grass in very ephemeral, very shallow wetlands where other water level management or manipulation was not possible, where it might not have been desirable or cost effective to use herbicide, but even sometimes in concert with herbicide treatments as well. But literally taking a moldboard plow to a wetland in July or August after it started to dry out on its own, and flip those rhizomes upside down, let it desiccate in the hot summer sun, and try to get the early annual succession plants more desirable by waterfowl and other wetland birds to grow the following growing season. And honestly, it was quite successful, quite easy. There might have been a time or two where the tractor got stuck, but we won't go there. There's no photographic evidence. It wasn't on Twitter then, so life is good.
That sounds good. I imagine that's a story for another day. And I must say, I've been guilty of getting a tractor stuck in wildlife habitat management myself. So we have the plow as the fire break, the plow as the food plot planter, the plow as the succession manager. I like that example you just shared, or also the plow as a tool to combat invasive species like reed canary grass. So we're kind of checking these off. Another one I wanted to ask you about is I wonder if there's another organization in the United States that's planted more prairie than your organization. I'm sure you would be competitive. So I'm curious about your thinking about the plow as a tool and just creating conditions for new ecosystems or restoration, as we might say, for prairies or forests or others.
Yeah, and where I really start to kind of hone in on with that context has to do with actually situations where the cow or the fire is not practical. And so the disc in particular, not necessarily flipping the sod 100% upside down, but just to create a little disturbance, basically mimicking the role historically of bison or more recently cattle. But the disc could be a great tool. And there's even some research out there, I think from Nebraska, where in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was kind of the preferred mid-contract management strategy, maybe along with some interseeding of legumes back into the mix. But when that grassland started to get a little decadent and there wasn't as much for the annual weeds, which of course play a key role for food resources, that the disc would be the equivalent to set that grassland back, get that flush of ragweeds and mare's tail and other annuals, and be a useful tool, a useful wildlife habitat management tool, and quite honestly, a fairly cost-efficient one too. You can cover a lot of acres in a short amount of time and fairly safely.
Yeah, I like that. That's certainly something that we see a lot, especially in the East, where frequent disturbances of native warm season grass stands are really important before they kind of just turn into dense monocultures of a few species of grass and no wildflowers or anything else. So that's a good one. What about the role of implements just generally in like planting prairie? Like what's that process, and how do you kind of think about that in wildlife habitat management?
So of course today we've got tools that are custom made specific for that purpose, and it's not just 2 or 3 or 4 species of grass, but these very diverse, very robust pollinator mixes, for example, 30, 40, 50 plus species. I think the highest one I ever did was over 100 different species. Wow. And of course, the no-till drill with the down pressure and the ability to go into that sod, that stubble, plays a key role. Certainly broadcast spreaders doing that over kind of a snowpack, frost seeding also plays a role in the habitat management. So, that tractor itself and those implements are commonly used today. And I don't think we'd be able to do our mission without them, quite honestly.
I think that's really cool, kind of the science of habitat establishment, or of, say, prairie establishment, has come a long way. Just listening to you talk, you can see like, oh, you're really tuned in on what these implements are doing and how we adjust. We take a tool from agriculture and we adjust it from planting, say, oats or other grasses, and we figured out how to make it work for native grasses in agricultural landscapes. And I think that's a really cool development over the last 40 years or so of the wildlife profession.
In the early days of kind of that local ecotype prairie restoration movement as well, it was maybe not terribly common, but it wasn't all that uncommon to modify and use an older combine, a grain combine, to harvest the seeds. And, with the appropriate settings and adjustments for the very, very tiny native seeds, to be able to use that equipment to be able to harvest it, and then, allow additional lands to be restored or added for additional diversity.
That's a neat example or a neat anecdote to share. One thing that always impressed me working on farms for all the wildlife research that I've done is just the ingenuity of farmers, just generally, like give them a solution and they have the tools to solve them. And that's a neat example of many where wildlife biologists have kind of followed in that mold to figure out how to solve these challenges of harvesting in large quantities native seeds of all different shapes and sizes, or planting those same native seeds or other things. It's kind of neat example of applying agricultural thinking to wildlife habitat and wildlife stewardship.
I agree.
Okay, so we want to sort of wrap up with one final question for you. And this could just sort of set the direction for the rest of the discussion. Is in that quote that we're structuring these episodes with, there's a word in there that we really like: the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it. We picked up on that, the creative use. And so we've talked about a lot of creative uses of the plow today, both really sort of tangible or applied creative uses like reed canary grass management and wetlands, and sort of metaphorical uses like precision conservation and things like that. I'm curious, what are you most excited about, or what example do you find the most promise in, of the things that we've talked about or other things, of an example of the creative use of the plow or agriculture generally in the stewardship of wildlife and wildlife habitat in North America?
It is without a doubt hard to pick one. So I'll cheat a little bit and pick two, but I'll go back to kind of one of the things that we touched on, of just the fact that there is abundant grain available today for so many of these wildlife species that wouldn't otherwise have had that nutrition, that food resource to choose from. And today, again, with these technological advances, we're able to plant actually with less of the plow, right? So our 5-bottom plow on our farm is parked out in the classic, tree row, tree belt, just growing lichens and rust. So it's been retired long ago, and it was because of advancements in technology, equipment technology, that allows us to not have as much disturbance on the land. So that's certainly a key part. But looking to the future, the other kind of bell curve trend that we're already seeing a little bit, but I think the next 10 years are going to be mind-blowing. So today, and for the last probably 3-4 decades plus, equipment sizes have just gotten continually bigger, more horsepower, more width. We're almost, I would say, to the apex of that bell curve, and things are trending, back the other direction. The reality is that right now, There's already the technology for autonomous tractors, autonomous units, actually the tractor and the drill as one. And that's only going to intensify. I mean, so the futuristic, versions of ag that are in laboratories right now and pilot type of demo sites, it's all about robotics, autonomous, which ultimately does then feed right into that. More data is going to be collected, more information is going to be at the fingertips. So the manual labor part of farming might change. Well, without a doubt will change, but you might be able to trade that time spent behind the wheel, literally, in the tractor and be more of a data scientist as a result of this evolution of equipment starting to trend downward. Fleets of equipment, certainly, UAVs playing a role. So think about the scenario where, first thing in the morning, the UAVs are going out collecting field level reports, information. Another set of drones are going out doing spot spraying, not just, blanket spraying across the entire field when only 5 or 10% has a particular pest or a, weed pressure issue. So all this is happening now, but the next, again, 5 and 10 years, we're going to see it become almost mainstream of deploying today. And once 5G becomes commonplace too, that'll further set the stage, and we're right on the doorstep of that. So it is dizzying at times, thinking about it. That's still certainly a part that I enjoy of farming, is that time behind the tractor. And so it's almost crazy to think about, my kids, certainly their kids, might not ever have that role. Their farming roles, if they so choose, might be entirely different. They might be playing video games at home on the couch.
Do you think all that technology then is going to be good for wildlife because it's going to allow for the more precise identification and negotiation of those areas that you talked about before that just aren't profitable, and we could put those into wildlife habitat and grow monarchs on them instead of growing short corn?
I'm mostly bullish on that aspect, that this trend does allow for more opportunities for us. But I think it also, we'd be maybe naive to think that it'll just happen automatically, that, we still have to kind of be at that table. Sportsmen and women, conservationists, researchers, other professionals need to be at that table to understand, to listen, to play a role, to see how they can support that, versus just, relying and hoping and assuming that it happens on its own. But yeah, I am optimistic that is part of the model going forward.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave it, because I really like that image of a wildlife biologist's job is now to understand this technology and think about new creative uses of farm implements. May not be a plow anymore. It may be a drone, or it may be a real sophisticated tractor that you just described that plants and drives across the field on its own. But still, the creative use of those is going to be really important in wildlife habitat, in agricultural landscapes. So Ryan, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the podcast.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.